Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor for me to introduce to you Professor Robert Alexy, the most distinguished German legal philosopher of our time. Professor Alexy studied law and philosophy at the University of Göttingen. In 1982, the Academy of Sciences in Göttingen recognized Professor Alexy with its prize in the fields of philology and history, awarded to him on the basis of the research that led to his dissertation, Theorie der juristischen Argumentation, which appeared as a book in 1978 and which was translated by Ruth Adler and Neil McCormick under the title A Theory of Legal Argumentation, published in 1989 by the Clarendon Press, Oxford. After serving as an assistant to Professor Ralph Dreyer in the Faculty of Law in Göttingen, Professor Alexy completed his habilitation in 1984 with the dissertation Theorie der Grundrechte, published in 1985 and appearing in 2002 under the title A Theory of Constitutional Rights with the Oxford University Press in a translation by Julian Rivers. Since 1985, Professor Alexy has been professor for legal philosophy and public law, first at the University of Regensburg and since 1986 at the University of Kiel. Between 1994 and 1998, he served as a president of the German section of the International Association of Legal and Social Philosophy, IBR. In 1992, he published the German edition of his book Begriff und Geltung des Rechts, translated into English by Bonnie and Stanley L. Paulson, and published in 2002 with the Clarendon Press, Oxford, under the title The Argument from Injustice, a Reply to Legal Positivism. Since 2002, Professor Alexy has been a member of the Academy of the Sciences in Göttingen in the fields of philology and history. In 2008 and 2009, Professor Alexy received honorary doctorates from the universities of Alicante, Buenos Aires, Tucumán, and Antwerp. Just a month ago, the Federal Republic of Germany conferred upon Professor Alexy its highest award, the First-Class Cross of Merit, Verdienstkreuz Erste Klasse der Verdienstordens der Bundesrepublik Deutschland. Professor Alexy's book and papers have been translated into over 20 languages. That is, original manuscripts in German and some of them in English have been translated into Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, French, Swedish, Lithuanian, Slovenian, Russian, Romanian, Estonian, Polish, Ukrainian, Bulgarian, Croatian, Finnish, Japanese, Chinese, Korean, and Arabic. In these writings, Professor Alexy has made very significant contributions to analytical jurisprudence and the theory of public law. Specifically, in a theory of legal argumentation, he laid the foundations for contesting skepticism about practical reasoning in general and legal argumentation in particular. Here he states a set of rules that provide for rationality in practical reasoning and determine the specific conditions for applying these rules within the framework of the law in order to create a congenial environment for the legal discourse, and especially a judicial discourse, that is able to guarantee procedural and substantial correctness to the greatest possible extent. Despite Professor Alexy's claim that a theory of constitutional rights offers only a general explanation of constitutional rights under the German Basic Law, its key structural elements, namely the concept of constitutional rights as of optimization requirements, the description of the different functions and kinds of constitutional rights, the law of collision, and the law of balancing, have been used in different legal systems to explain rights and to guide their application by means of judicial review. In this work, the leading question was that on the concept and the structure of constitutional rights, a question that had been raised before by such authors as Paul Laband, Otto von Gerbach, Georg Jelinek, Hans Kelsen, and Rudolf Schwendt, who aimed an account of the rights guaranteed by the Paulskirche Constitution in 1948 and the Weimar Constitution in 1919. In his treatise, Professor Alexy also provided a reconstruction of the German Federal Constitutional Court's case law on constitutional rights. Some of the elements of this reconstruction, such as the law of balancing, have been directly influential in the jurisprudence of several constitutional courts abroad. Professor Alexy's book has even been explicitly quoted by some of these courts, including the Supreme Court of Israel, the Mexican Federal Electoral Court, and the Constitutional Courts of Colombia and Peru. Finally, in the argument from injustice and in recent papers, some of them translated into Spanish and collected and published together by Marcial Pons in the book El concepto y la naturaleza del derecho, on the concept and the nature of law, Professor Alexy directly challenges legal positivism and endorses a view that he terms inclusive non-positivism. The key element of his view is a version of the so-called connection thesis. According to it, quote, there is a necessary connection between legal validity or legal correctness on the one hand and moral merits and demerits or moral correctness and incorrectness on the other, end quote. Professor Alexy's version of this thesis has been the target of objections raised by prominent legal philosophers. Professor Eugenio Bulygin has raised 3 rounds of challenges to Professor Alexy's view on the concept and the nature of law. In his lecture today, Professor Alexy replies to the 3rd of these rounds.
Yes. Thank you very much for your very kind introduction, perhaps too kind. I start with my paper. Serious criticism honors and challenges an author. Eugenio Bulygin offers me now for the 3rd time the great benefit of his critique, and I am delighted to have occasion here to respond. First section, normative arguments and the concept of law. In the argument from injustice, a reply to legal positivism, I defended the non-positivistic connection thesis, which says that law necessarily includes moral element, and I claim that the supporting arguments for this thesis can be divided into 2 groups, analytical and normative. On this basis, I propose to call a connection supported by normative arguments normatively necessary. Normative necessity is explained in the following way, quotation, that something is normatively necessary means nothing other than that it is commanded. Bulygin argues that this idea of a normative necessity is extremely doubtful. The use of the term necessary instead of terms like obligatory or binding, he maintains, can only lead to linguistic confusions, and he poses the question of who is it that can command the connection thesis, his conclusion, a longer quotation. All this sounds extremely strange. If there are conceptual connections between law and morality, then there is no need to resort to normative arguments. Either the element of morality is included in the concept of law, or it is not. If it is included, then normative arguments are superfluous. If it is not included, they are useless. My reply to this is that there exists indeed a conceptually necessary inclusion of morality into the concept of law, but this makes normative arguments by no means superfluous, as Eugenio Bulygin suggests. On the contrary, it makes normative arguments necessary. In the argument from injustice, I describe the relationship between analytical and normative arguments as a relation of supplementation and strengthening. In order to meet Bulygin's objection, I have to add to this the relation of inclusion. The argument from inclusion consists of two parts. And the first part is this. It is a conceptual necessity that law raises a claim to correctness. The second part of the argument is that this claim to correctness necessarily leads to an inclusion of non-authoritative normative, that is moral elements, not only at the level of the application of law, but also at the level of determining the nature and defining the concept of law. Eugenio Bulygin remarks that the necessity of the claim to correctness is a topic that has given rise to a long discussion between us, and that, with the exception of two additional remarks, he does not wish to take up this theme still another time today. I shall follow him on this point, confining myself to comments on his two additional remarks. This, however, shall be taken up later. For the present, I will presuppose that law necessarily raises a claim to correctness. That is, I will take the first part of the argument from inclusion as given. This means that my position as presented here acquires a hypothetical character. It will be an answer to the question if law necessarily lays a claim to correctness, normative arguments can be employed in the determination of the nature and the definition of the concept of law. Law's claim to correctness, and the following 4 lines are the center of my argument on the first point, the following 4 lines. Law's claim to correctness refers not only to the question of whether the application of law in a concrete case is correct, but also to the question of whether it is correct at all to apply law. The first concerns the concrete dimension, the second, the abstract dimension of the claim to correctness. The abstract claim to correctness, for its part, also has 2 dimensions, a real dimension and an ideal dimension. The most abstract principle of the ideal dimension is justice. The idea of justice as such, that is morality simpliciter, does not, however, suffice to resolve the problems of social coordination and cooperation. The moral costs of anarchy can be avoided only by law understood as an enterprise that strives to realize the value or principle of legal certainty. For that reason, law's claim to correctness refers not only to justice, but also to positivity, as defined by authoritative issuance and social efficiency. This is what I have termed the real dimension of the claim to correctness. In this way, the claim to correctness necessarily connects both the principle of justice and the principle of legal certainty with law. This is an expression of the dual nature of law. If justice as well as legal certainty are necessarily connected with law, a participant in the legal system confronted with unjust law must ask himself whether justice as necessarily connected with law requires that he considered the unjust law as valid law. If the principle of justice were the only relevant principle here, the answer would be easy. The dual nature of law, however, requires also that he consider the principle of legal certainty. This is to say that in order to determine the borderline between valid law on the one hand and invalid law on the other, he has to strike a balance. The determination of this line, however, is a question that concerns the concept and the nature of law. Elsewhere, I've argued that the correct result of this balancing between justice and legal certainty is that the principle of legal certainty precedes justice in all cases of injustice, except for the case of extreme injustice. This corresponds to Radbruch's formula. 4 points are of interest. Here, balancing, and this is the first point, concerns the problem of the concept and the nature of law. That is, the concept and the nature of law is made dependent as a result of balancing. The second is that the arguments applied in this balancing are normative or moral arguments. The third point is that these normative or moral arguments are, owing to the claim to correctness, necessarily connected with the concept of law. This necessary connection implies that it is impossible for a participant in a legal system to say what law is without saying what law ought to be. And this, in turn, answers Bulygin's question, who is it that can command the connection thesis? It is a claim to correctness taken seriously by the participant. By contrast with the observers is, the participants is includes an ought. Finally, the fourth point concerns Bulygin's thesis that normative arguments are superfluous once the element of morality is included in the concept of law. In referring to justice, the claim to correctness contains moral elements, and it is included in the concept of law. The inclusion of the claim to correctness, and this has an analytical character. The inclusion of the claim to correctness, however, does not as such imply that the principle of justice becomes superfluous as an argument supporting the definition of the concept of law. The claim to correctness, taken by itself, does not have sufficient content to carry out this task. For this reason, the principles or values to which it, the claim to correctness, necessarily refers are indispensable. Next section, the observer's perspective. The distinction between the perspective of the observer and the participant has played an important role in the consideration enumerating above on the relation between the concept of law and normative arguments. The distinction is, indeed, a central element of the non-positivistic theory of law. This leads one to expect that the distinction will be seen critically by positivists. Bulygin's first point concerning this issue is that, I quote, the dichotomy between observers and participants is not so sharp as Alexy seems to believe. Most observers are at the same time participants, and all participants are also observers. I wish to begin with comments on this by noting that the distinction at issue is not between persons but between perspectives. The participant's perspective is defined by the question, what is the correct legal answer? The observer's by the question, which legal decisions have actually been made, are actually being made, and will actually be made. The version of non-positivism that I wish to defend defines law by means of three elements: authoritative issuance, social efficiency, and correctness of content. Authoritative issuance and social efficiency concern the real or factual dimension of law. Correctness of content, its ideal or critical dimension. This implies what cannot come as a surprise, that non-positivism includes positivistic elements. This inclusion of positivistic elements in turn implies that the participant's perspective necessarily includes the observer's perspective. To this extent, Bulygin is then right in maintaining that all participants are also observers. In this case, however, the observer's perspective is subordinate to the participant's perspective. The answer given to the observer's question, as hard cases make clear, is not necessarily the final answer, as it would be in case of a pure observer. A pure observer. This is also the crucial point where Bulygin's thesis is that most observers are at the same time participants is concerned. This might be read as follows. There are many fewer pure observers than participants. Bulygin's main arguments against my description of the observer's perspective is that it gives rise to a contradiction. The quotation. There's a clear contradiction between the thesis that the non-positivistic concept of law necessarily includes moral element and Alexy's assertion that even an extreme unjust system as a governor order is nevertheless a legal system. What moral elements does this order contain? My reply to this is that it by no means gives rise to a contradiction. In order to establish a non-positivistic concept of law, one has to defend the connection thesis, which says that there is a necessary connection between law and morality, or, more precisely, between legal validity or legal correctness on the one hand and moral correctness on the other. The correctness thesis requires not more than just one connection of this kind. Such a connection exists in any case in the participant's perspective, for instance, Radbruch formula, and this perspective is the fundamental perspective. Law is impossible. Why it is the fundamental perspective? The participants. Law is impossible without participants, but it would be possible without pure observers. The necessary connection in this necessary perspective suffices to establish a non-positivistic concept of law. If, alongside this, there were no necessary connection in the observer perspective, this would not affect the non-positivistic concept of law. This by itself would be enough to dismiss Bulygin's approach of contradiction. It can be added to this that a necessary connection exists even from the observer's perspective. A system of rules that does not lay claim to correctness is not a legal system, even from the point of view of an observer. The claim to correctness, however, necessarily raised by law implies a necessary connection between law and morality. Bulygin's reproach of contradiction is therefore wrong for two reasons. Bulygin links this reproach to another objection. The existence of a legal system requires only that the claim to correctness is raised. The claim need not be met. Thus, from the observer's perspective, a system of rules can be considered as a legal system even if it is extremely unjust, provided that the claim to correctness is raised. Now, Bulygin argues that such a hypocritical claim is, from a moral point of view, considerably worse than an open predatory order. Quotation. For this reason, he maintains, the thesis that the claim to correctness transforms the bandits' order into a legal system, one might call it the transformation thesis, is certainly incompatible with the assertion that the concept of law necessarily includes moral elements. It is, that is to say, incompatible with the connection thesis. So, Bulygin. I agree with Bulygin that extreme injustice, along with hypocrisy, is morally worse than extreme injustice without hypocrisy. I do not think, however, that this leads to any incompatibilities between the transformation thesis and the connection thesis. The opposite is true. Tyrants, despots, and dictators usually strive to acquire legitimacy in order to avoid open suppression. For this reason, they mask the suppression by means of a legal facade. The necessity of the claim to correctness implies, in this case, the necessity of hypocrisy. And public hypocrisy endangers legitimacy. Show trials, for instance, are an attempt to eliminate opponents in a legitimate way. They are, however, owing to hypocrisy, at the same time a risk for legitimacy. The fact that the claim to correctness never allows tyrants to attain more than hypocritical legitimacy does not refute the connection thesis. It corroborates it. Third section, the participant's perspective. The observer's perspective is a perspective rather favorable to positivism. The case is different with the participant's perspective. Bulygin nevertheless argues that positivism also fits in the case of the participant's perspective best, especially the perspective of a judge. His argument is based on the distinction between plain and hard cases. A plain case is at hand when, quotation, the existing legal rules determine a univocal and clear solution of the case. According to Bulygin, in such, quotation, a situation, only the observer's perspective is relevant also for the judge. Here, one must object. To be sure, in many cases, the authoritative material, especially statutes and precedents, dictate a univocal answer. Nevertheless, the ostensible clarity of plain cases is not a simple matter. One who asserts that the solution is clear is to be understood as asserting that there are no arguments that might give rise to serious doubts. Such arguments, however, are always conceivable. Bulygin alludes to such arguments when he says that, quotation, it is possible that the judge decides not to apply the existing norm. and to resort to another norm, eventually created by himself, and that does not belong to the system at the time of his decision. End quotation. This shows that the categorization of a case as plain includes a negative judgment with respect to all possible counter-arguments. These possible counter-arguments comprise moral reasons. This negative judgment transcends, therefore, the observer's perspective. It is conceivable only as an act performed from the participant's perspective. For this reason, it is never the case that only the observer's perspective is relevant also for the judge. Positivists and non-positivists generally agree that every positive law has, as Hart remarked, an open texture. This is necessitated inter alia by the vagueness of legal language, the possibility of a conflict between norms, the gaps that exist in the law, and the possibility of deciding a case contrary to the language of a statute in special cases. Cases within the scope of this open texture are hard cases. Like Kelsen and Hart, Bulygin argues that no argument against positivism can be grounded on the existence of hard cases. In such cases, the judge has to be seen as creating new law on basis other than legal standards and according to his own discretion, much as in the case of a legislator. The positivistic concept of law, Bulygin stresses, is in no way affected by this. I quote, "In which way can these facts influence the concept of law? Does it mean that the judge uses another concept of law than the external observer that wants to describe it? I don't think so. When the judge does not apply a valid norm, because in his opinion its application would lead to great injustice, and instead applies another norm, eventually created by him, this cannot be described as a modification of the concept of law. What is modified in such case are the norms or rule of a legal system, not the concept of law." End quotation. I agree with Bulygin that the contra legem decision of the judge cannot be described as a modification of the concept of law by this judge. What the judge thinks he is doing or says, what a judge thinks he is doing or says he is doing is not decisive. What is decisive is what he really does and what the law necessarily requires him to do. This is a question of the correct description of legal decision-making. Bulygin describes legal decision-making in hard cases as a law-making act that transforms moral consideration into law. I think that this description is insufficient. The first point of my argument is again the claim to correctness. A judge necessarily raises this claim. The second point is that this claim refers, like Rath's claim to legitimate moral authority, not only to positive law, but also to justice, that is, to morality. Bulygin's argument might be interpreted as saying that the avoidance of great injustice is only a personal or subjective concern of the judge, and not something that is objectively required by law's claim to correctness. If this subjective interpretation should reflect Bulygin's intention, then our respective descriptions take altogether different paths already at this point. But a positivist can grant the point that law's claim to correctness comprises a claim to moral correctness. and nevertheless contests the claim that this amounts to a necessary connection between legal validity or legal correctness and morality. This third point seems to be the decisive one. My thesis is that a necessary connection, once one have arrived at the third point, is indispensable. One might imagine a case in which the positive law allows for two different interpretations, I1 and I2. I1 is just, I2 unjust. In this case, law's claim to correctness requires I1. Perhaps positivists and non-positivists may agree up to this point. Disagreement begins when the question has to be answered of what happens when I2, that is, the unjust interpretation, is chosen. According to positivism, the decision is a legally perfect decision with moral defects. According to non-positivism, the decision is not only morally defective, but also legally defective. It is legally defective for not only is morality's claim to correctness violated in the case of a morally defective decision, but also law's claim to correctness is violated too. This leads to a necessary qualifying or ideal connection between law and morality. With this, the claim to correctness implies that law necessarily comprises an ideal dimension as well as a real or authoritative dimension. That defects in either dimension are legal defects can, however, be adequately grasped only by means of a non-positivistic concept of law. This is a theoretical aspect of the problem. A practical aspect has to be added. If the defect were only a moral one, it would be difficult to explain why a higher court should have the power to set aside unjust decisions of a lower court in case in which a just decision is as compatible with the positive law as the unjust one. Construction, thrust and parry. In the argument from injustice, I presented two cases with an eye to demonstrating the practical significance of the debate over positivism. The first concerns the application of Radbruch's formula to the 11th Ordinance 25 November 1941, issued pursuant to the Statute on Reich Citizenship of 15 September 1935, which stripped immigrant Jews of German citizenship and property on grounds of race. The second case concerns the permissibility of a development of law by judges that is contrary to the literal reading of a statute, the permissibility, in other words, of a contra legem decision. Both decisions express a non-positivistic understanding of law. Bulygin argues that the non-positivistic arguments put forward in these cases are no more than rhetorical quotation devices, by means of which judges attempt to conceal that they are really changing the law. For this reason, one has to distinguish between what judges say that they do and what they are doing really. The German Federal Constitutional Court declared the 11th Ordinance was null and void, that is, invalid from the outset, because its conflict with justice reached an intolerable degree. Bulygin objects that the 11th Ordinance was in fact valid norm in German of the German law during Nazism. What the court really did was to annul the ordinance ad tunc, that is, retroactively. Something similar applies, according to Bulygin, to the contra legem case. The German Federal Constitutional Court simply empowers judges to create new norms in critical cases. Now, Bulygin is right in maintaining that one has to distinguish between what judges say they are doing and what they really are doing. But this distinction does not imply that judges are always doing something different from what they say they are doing. In order to show this, one has to analyze their arguments. Bulygin simply substitute for the non-positivistic construction a positivistic construction. The mere confrontation of the non-positivistic construction with a positivistic construction does not suffice, however, as a rejection of the non-positivistic construction. For this purpose, it has to be shown that the positivistic construction of the cases is better than the non-positivistic counterpart. To show this is to show, inter alia, that positivism is better able to grasp the nature of law than non-positivism. But this is precisely the question at issue. Bulygin's criticism of the two decisions, therefore, presupposes what has to be established. The 2 points, section 5, concerning the claim to correctness. In my second reply to Bulygin, I compared the following 2 sentences. 10, faulty legal systems are faulty, and 11, continental legal systems are continental. The result I arrived at was, how could it have been otherwise? That both are trivial, and that the triviality is of the same kind in both cases. I then continued as follows, quotation, nevertheless, there is a difference concerning the relation of the predicates faulty and continental to the concept of a legal system. The difference stems from the fact that legal systems necessarily raise a claim to correctness, whereas they do not necessarily raise the claim to be or not to be continental. Bulygin objects, but then the sentence 10 is not as trivial as 11, and consequently, it is not an ordinary tautology. This sounds very rare, end of quotation. I agree with Bulygin that it would be rather strange to consider 10 as less trivial than 11. But this is not my point. The triviality of 10 and 11 stems from the relation between faulty and faulty on the one hand, and continental on the other. The relation between faulty and faulty is the same as the relation between continental and continental. The difference to which I referred, perhaps in a way that suggested misunderstanding, concerns the relation between the concept of a legal system on the one hand and the predicates faulty and continental on the other. My point is that being continental is not necessarily connected with the concept of a legal system, whereas there exists a necessary connection with where faultiness is concerned. The necessary connection stems first from the necessity of the claim to correctness and second from a negation. The claim to correctness is equivalent to the claim not to be faulty or defective, for correctness is non-faultiness or non-defectiveness. This implies that the necessity of the claim to correctness necessarily connects the concept of non-faultiness with law. When I said, it is the necessity of the claim to correctness which gives faultiness a special character, I had this in mind. According to Bulygin, my argument is not only very rare, but also circular. The claim to correctness, I quote, is necessary because normative systems that raise it without fulfilling it are faulty, and this faultiness has a special character because it is based on the necessity of the claim. So the necessity of the claim is at the same time a reason and a consequence of this claim. Indeed, I claim that the concepts of correctness and faultiness, or defectiveness, are analytically connected by means of negation. But I do not claim that this equivalence is a relation of substantive reason. That substantive reason is a performative contradiction argument, and substantive consequence, as it would have to be if the reproach of circularity were defensible. Bulygin's second comment on the claim to correctness concerns the kind of connection that is established by this claim. In the argument from injustice, I made a distinction between a weak and a strong version of the connection thesis. I quote, "In the weak version, the thesis says that a necessary connection exists between law and some morality. The strong version has it that a necessary connection exists between law and the right or correct morality." Bulygin presents a formalization of these two versions, which employs L for law, M for morality, and I for the relation of inclusion. The weak version says, for all X, if X is law, then there exists epsilon, and epsilon is M, and epsilon is included in X. Whereas the strong version maintains there exists an epsilon, an M, and all legal system included. Bulygin is entirely right in saying that the weak version causes no problem for all positivists, for no positivist would deny that every law includes some moral principles. His argument is, therefore, directly solely to the strong version. Here he presents two objections. I quote now, "There are at least two objections that can be raised against this idea. In the first place, it is by no means clear that there is something like the correct or true morality. And secondly, one must distinguish between the correct morality and the idea of a correct morality. Even if there were no correct morality, one correct morality, there certainly are different ideas of it. In order to prove that the strong connection thesis is true, one should be able to show that all persons have the same idea of a correct morality. This is extremely improbable. Is it the same what such people as Kant, Hitler, Stalin, Gandhi, or Bush have understood by a correct morality? End of quotation. These two objections show that the concept of morality used in the strong correctionist thesis, that is in 2, can be understood in quite different ways. The strongest interpretation would have M in 2 understood as representing first the one and only correct morality conceivable, second, as a system of moral norms that provide for a single right answer to each moral question, which, third, can be established in a real discourse. This shall be expressed by M1. Now it is easy to see that the thesis, there exists M1, is difficult to defend. There are many moral questions for which a single right answer cannot be established in a real discourse. This suffices to preclude the possibility that 2, that is a strong connection thesis, is to be interpreted by means of M1. M1 is too strong an interpretation of M. Bulygin's second objection turns to the idea of correct morality. In order to understand what Bulygin means by the idea of a correct morality, one has to look at the list of people he presents in connection with such an idea. This list comprises Kant, Hitler, Stalin, Gandhi, and Bush. This suggests that Bulygin simply wants to say that different people have different moral ideas. Morality M in 2 would then stand for a morality that is actually or really held. Such a morality shall be represented by M2. Now, the thesis, there exists an M2, is without any doubt true. But 2, that is a strong version of the connection thesis, would be mistaken if one substituted M2 for M. There exists no actually held morality that is included in all legal systems. For this reason, M2 is too weak an interpretation of M. The question is whether an interpretation of M is possible that is neither too strong nor too weak. It is, I think, possible. For there exists a third interpretation of M, M3, that suffices as a basis of a defense of the strong connection thesis. This third interpretation leads to there exists M3. M3 consists of 2 elements. The first element is a theory of basic human rights that can be established as discursively necessary. This is an elementary form of the one and only correct or right morality, but it does not suffice to provide for a single right answer to each and every moral question, because human rights can be balanced and interpreted in very many different ways. The second element consists of the rules and forms of rational practical argumentation or discourse. The first element is substantive, the second procedural. To be sure, these 2 elements, even taken together, by no means guarantee a single right answer in each and every case. They define, however, a regulative idea that transcends the convictions of actual persons. It is an idea necessary for all rational beings. This idea defines the ideal dimension of law. Interpreted in this way, the strong connection thesis is true. 6. Inclusive non-positivism. The title of Bulygin's article, Alexy between positivism and non-positivism, might give rise to the impression that there exists a third position or third way between positivism and non-positivism. I think that this impression would be mistaken. One can only be a positivist or a non-positivist, tertium non datur. The decisive criterion is whether a necessary connection of whatever kind is assumed between legal validity or legal correctness on the one hand and moral correctness on the other. Bulygin maintains that my thesis that the positivistic separation thesis is essentially correct from the observer's perspective, quotation, puts an end to the debate between positivism and non-positivism, at least concerning the concept of law, because positivism is interested not in the application of law, but in its identification. This has to be rejected for 3 reasons. The first is that my statements about the correctness of the positivistic separation thesis from the observer's perspective does not simply say that the separation thesis is correct. It says that it is essentially correct. This allows for restrictions. A highly important restriction stems from the fact that every legal system lays claim to correctness. This indeed has few practical consequences, for actually existing system of norms regularly lay claim to correctness, however feebly justified the claim may be. It has, however, significant systematic consequences. Specifically, it excludes from the concept of law those system of norms that do not raise the claim to correctness. In this way, it restricts the positivistic separation thesis a good bit, even in the observer's perspective. The second reason for rejecting Bulygin's thesis of the end of the debate between positivism and non-positivism is that the concept of law is by no means a concern solely of positivism. As just stated, even from the observer's perspective, a necessary connection exists. It stems from the claim to correctness. Over and above this, from the participant's perspective, normative arguments are necessarily included in the concept of law, as I have argued in the first part of this paper, where I discuss the relation between normative arguments and the concept of law. These normative arguments establish a threshold of extreme injustice as expressed by Radbruch's formula. This concerns, as I have attempted to show in the fourth part of this text, where I discuss the relation between construction and counter-construction, not only the application but also the identification of law. The formula does not say that extreme injustice should not be law, but rather that extreme injustice is not law. The third reason for rejecting Bulygin's end of the debate thesis is that the claim to correctness has the effect, as elaborated in the third part of this article, where I discuss the participant's perspective of transforming moral defectiveness into legal defectiveness. This too is an issue concerning the concept of law. To be sure, the version of non-positivism that I defend contains strong positivistic elements. It by no means substitutes correctness of content for authoritative issuance and social efficiency. On the contrary, both are necessarily included. For this reason, the version of non-positivism I wish to defend can be characterized as inclusive non-positivism. But this inclusion does not mean that law is reduced to the real dimension as defined by issuance and efficiency. The ideal dimension as defined by correctness is alive too. Bulygin suggests that this is no more than a metaphorical invocation. My reply is that the exclusion from the concept of law of those systems of law that do not lay claim to correctness and of individual norms that are extremely unjust shows, along with the transformation of moral defectiveness into legal defectiveness by the claim to correctness, that this is not the case. This provides an answer to Bulygin's final thesis that the quotation discrepancy looks very like a verbal one. The dispute between positivism and non-positivism is not a verbal issue. On the contrary, it reaches to the essence of law. Thank you.
If I'm not mistaken, I think we have 5 topics for discussion. The first one is analytic and normative arguments for the connection thesis. The second one, the point about participant and observer's perspective. The third one one about judicial decisions, the 4-1, the 2 points on the claim to correctness, and finally the statement of the view of the inclusive non-positivism. Then I'm going to ask first Eugenio to respond, and then everyone who wants to.
I'm afraid that we could continue indefinitely with this discussion, which would make much fun for me, for instance. I hope also for my friend Alexy. So there is no trouble in continuing discussing. But there are some points which seem to me rather dubious in the response by Robert. What looks very doubtful is his idea of ideal dimension of law. What does it mean that the law has an ideal dimension? It means, if it means that there are just laws and unjust laws, I don't object, of course, this is trivial, absolutely true. But he maintains that the claim to correctness implies this ideal dimension of law. And this is, for me, really obscure. I don't see how a claim to correctness can imply the ideal dimension of law. What does imply a claim to something? Well, just that somebody claims something. But from this we cannot derive any factual or empirical consequence. If I claim to be a new Kant, well, you would perhaps try to tolerate this extravagancy of mine, but it would not prove in any case that I am like Kant or similar to Kant as a philosopher. No, my claim would be absolutely without consequences. And the claim to correctness has also the same dimension. It is claimed by certain people, or perhaps Alexy would say it is claimed by all those who issue norms, legal norms, a legislature, a judge, perhaps even private people, as far as they pretend to invoke legal norms. But this is still a claim by certain people. I don't see how this claim can make any change in the nature of law. Law is not just a claim. Law consists of legal rules or norms that can be efficacious or not. It can be used actually by judges or lawyers or not. But the fact that they claim to be correct doesn't change anything at all. So I think that this ideal dimension is really just a kind of ideology which is not really important for the functioning of law. This is not my only objection to Alexy. I think also that Alexy appeals too often to the term necessarily. There are certain necessities which are rather doubtful. It is doubtful that the claim to correctness is necessary. Why should it be necessary? Why could not law be there without necessarily claiming correctness? That in fact, legal rules or legal norms claim to be correct, well, this is without doubt true. But I don't see which is the concept of necessity included in it. Well, I think the best thing to do is to leave to you the decision, or rather to put questions to both of us.
Yes, I only a very short response. We had two concepts, Eugenio. The concept of the ideal and the concept of necessity. It's a very short remark. A claim to correctness as connected with law is a kind of assertion. There is an institutional act, a judgment of a court, for instance. Let's take this as an example, and that is based on empowerment. And I agree with all things as Kelsen, for instance, and many others has said to this. And my point is very simple, that this act of empowerment, this institutional act in the sense of the speech act theory, an institutional act, that this institutional act of setting a norm, an individual norm, in a judicial decision, that this institutional act is connected, I say so necessary in the next point, is connected with a non-institutional act. That is the point. And this non-institutional act is an assertion and expectation. We can we today only want to look at the assertoric element. With the assertion, my decision is correct. That says the judge. And you say, well, this is not important for the functioning of law. I think nothing is more important, perhaps with exemption to coercion, for the functioning of law. For law in a working legal system has to do with argument, convictions, acceptance, and the people accept. It is even analyzed from an empirical point of view. It is a condition of acceptance of the legal system and of social efficiency. Therefore, I think it is that's my first point. It is very important to comprise, to understand that law is not merely a power play, but a play of doing the right thing between persons in a society. That is the, and we see, that is the first point. It is important for understanding what we are doing when we are making law in which form soever. And secondly, I think it is important to see what reasons we can have to criticize a legal system decision qua a legal decision. Well, and now the necessity. The necessity, I think it is indeed perhaps the most important question, for one can assume that the concept of necessity is perhaps the most important philosophical concept. For many concepts are connected with the concept of necessity, and we receive completely different conceptions of philosophy, philosophy without necessity and philosophy with necessity. And many people say since Quine, two dogmas of empiricism in the early 50s, we cannot any longer talk about analyticity, necessity, and something like this. Well, I would prefer the argument put forward, I think, 2 or 3 years later already, and now we engage in a philosophical debate, which Grice and Peter Strawson attacked Quine very vividly and developed something like a concept of relative necessity in their article. I think in any case we cannot simply say because Quine has written an article, the concept and philosophy which has one of the main concepts about all the time, and we have the work of Kripke, Aaron Kripke and Hilary Putnam, and necessity is still central. Nothing is decided on necessity in philosophy. Let me put it in this way. And one method of detecting whether something is necessity is the test, the contradictory test. If it is negated, does this lead to an interesting other assertion, or does it lead to a contradiction? If we, people who want to say there exists no necessity should always also say there is no real contradiction. And I think that we can say, and that is my examples, there is a contradiction, and we have discussed these examples. If you make a constitution and say X is a sovereign, federal, and unjust republic, is something strange in this sentence. Or if a judge says X is convicted to lifelong imprisonment and this is an incorrect interpretation of law. And these absurdity can be, this is to make it as fast as possible, this absurdity can, as often with absurdity, explained by contradiction, and contradiction can explain the necessity. So that we have a two-step arguments from absurdity to contradiction, and from contradiction to necessity. That is my answer as short as possible to your 2 remarks.
Thank you. Scott Shapiro.
Thank you very much. I can't pretend that I truly followed everything that went on here, but I just wanted to just respond to Professor Bulygin's last point that he made against Professor Alexy, that the claim to correctness can't affect the nature of law. That just seemed to me way just too strong of a claim. I mean, the difference between a madman and an actor is pretending, right? So an actor playing Kant claims to be Kant, right? And that's what makes him an actor and not crazy. Same thing about a liar. I mean, it's just a kind of a feature of many aspects of social life, that claiming to be something kind of makes you the thing that you are. So I just don't see how that's you seem baffled by it, but I don't think that's baffling. But the second thing, I'm not sure why any of this matters. I mean, so grant that there's an ideal element to law, that is that the law aspires to correctness, that it's defective if it's not correct, morally speaking, but that wouldn't mean that even a wicked, an extremely unjust system is not a legal system. That is, you can grant all this and just and still be a good positivist. I just, again, I don't see why any of it matters. I don't want to be. I'm not. Obviously, the debate between positivism. Hello. Yeah. Obviously, that meant I'm not belittling the debate. Obviously, I'm just saying that I don't see how granting an ideal element to the law kind of concedes the position to the non-positivist. That was the point.
If by positivism you understand the position of those people who only try to describe the existing law without any evaluation of it, then I don't see any difficulty for a positivistic position. Even if the legislators or the judges pretend to be correct. I have worked as a judge for many years, but I never pretended to say that what I decided was really the correct decision. I was much more modest in my pretension. No claim to correctness, only claim to decide a more or less fair way to reach what seemed to me a just decision. But I never claimed that my decision was the voice of justice. Perhaps in case of legislation, the situation, but I don't think it's very different. Many of the members of the legislation vote for or against a statute without pretending that what they do is the correct decision. It's just only what they believe, or it seems to them to be a good decision, nothing else. So in this sense, I think the claim to correctness as presented by Alexy is an exaggeration. Not always lawgivers or judges or just lawyers pretend or claim to make a correct decision or a correct law in this sense in which Alexy states. So, as far as you concede that positivism is not more than just what they do is just to try to describe the law as it really functions, I think there is no trouble for the positivistic position. And you can't derive from the claim of correctness a non-positivistic claim.
Yep. Well, my answer starts with the concept of a legal act. A courtroom decision is a legal act. And and now we can conceive of this legal act as pure empowerment. Or we can conceive of this legal act consisting of two elements. First element is exercise of power, and the second is raising a claim to correctness. And I think we must do so. But, Eugenio, we must ask what is the content of the claim to correctness. You have said you have tried you have at least tried to find a just or fair decision. And I think this claim to correctness surely can comprise skeptical elements. It would be crazy to conceive of the content of the claim to correctness that if you say, I have made this decision and I can say you it is, I can give you the guarantee that it's the only right answer and so on. You can only, you try, you have to end. That is the first point. And the second is, you are making this decision in the institutional context of law. And this is that the claim to correctness raised by an official has two dimensions. First, that it is correct to apply the law, that it is correct to do so because of the systematical contested character of many moral concepts, for instance, the concept of justice, that it is correct to make, even in questions of justice, decisions by persons who have authority to do so. And then, however, that these persons must say, we have the best done we have concerning correctness. That is the claim to correctness. We have attempted to make it correct. And if your attempt to make a fair decision failed and it comes out it was not a fair decision, and if this institutional act, that is my point, if this institutional act failed to make a correct decision and make an unjust decision, then it is not a perfect decision, it is a faulty decision. It is a faulty decision, even if you have done the best you could. And this is the point. This is the point that the act, the legal act, gets a completely other character. A completely other character. It goes to another world if it is connected with a claim to correctness, and if it is not only, if it would be possible for judges to raise a claim to correctness or to do it not, then it would not matter if the decision was incorrect. Concerning, if it is in the open texture and you have made an unjust decision, then it does not matter if it is not correct. And I think the practical aspect I talked about, if the higher court says it is not correct because it is unjust, if the claim to correctness is necessarily connected with this, then it is a legal argument for abolishing the decision. That changes something in the legal system if we make this. And last not least, I think on this depends a lot. On the relationship between legal decision making, that is law, and society. If the claim to correctness is raised, not only the higher courts control the lower ones, but there can be a public discussion about whether the decision was right, and we have in open societies such a discussion. And if you, on the other hand, make the law an autonomous and closed thing in a society, then you can say, we as lawyers have made this, and you can have now a political discourse, a moral discourse, but we are separated from these discourses. And therefore we can say that the claim to correctness is not only a speech act theoretical point concerning the institutional act of making a decision, it has a broader a broader perspective in deliberative or discursive democracy. This opens the judiciary to society arguments, and therefore I not only speak of an ideal dimension, but an ideal and critical dimension.
I don't know. I don't know if you wanna. I don't know if you wanna say something about the important point raised by Scott Shapiro, whether granting an ideal dimension of law is incompatible with legal positivism. Is that the point? Mm-hmm.
I would like to raise two questions. First, do you admit that there may be a mistake in the judicial decision, even of the Supreme Court, or no? If the Supreme Court decides on false presupposition, for instance, on factually false presupposition, the court decides that X killed Y, whereas in fact X didn't kill Y. What about the claim to correctness? And the second point is that the claim to correctness doesn't prove anything, because take the situation of priests of any religion. All priests believe in the existence of God, and they claim that God exists. But does it prove that God exists? A priest that would not claim this would be no priest. He would fail to fulfill his role as a priest. But it doesn't prove that God exists. You need other proofs to affirm the existence of God. The mere claim of religions or religious people that the God exists is not enough to prove that there is a God, really.
Yes. Two answers. First, naturally, a Supreme Court can make a failed or wrong decision, naturally. And it's, we have the public discourse to criticize this. That's my first point. Second, the priest. Naturally, the priest makes claims. But something is correct, a practical question, if it is justifiable. That is, the claim to correctness is the claim to justifiability. Well, the priest has some problems with justifiability. He must now start to make proofs of the existence of God. And Kant had said something on this. And if we would say, in questions of justice, there never can be an answer that can be supported or backed by reasons. All questions in the theory of justice are questions of ideology. Then we should identify the claim to correctness, even the claim to correctness of law, as by something like John Mackey's error theory. Then if moral arguments are impossible, then the claim to correctness, as far as it refers to the moral or ideal dimension, would be an illusion.
It is.
Well, now perhaps we come close to the decisive point.
Pierluigi Chiassoni.
I have a remark for Professor Alexy on this last point, because I think the argument you've proposed is a giant castle of cards. And I'll try to pull out the card, one of the cards which make it fall down. I try, of course. Your M3, you say that it is an idea necessary for all rational beings. I think here you reach the ultimate point of your argument, but here you don't provide any argument at all, because a rational being is precisely the person who accepts your theory, who buys your theory. So, when you say that the strong connection thesis is true, no, it's not true. Here we see that your theory hangs definitely on an ultimate irrational, subjective, moral choice. Thank you.
Yes, thank you too. I think, indeed, that there are some moral requirements that have necessary and universal character. And I have not elaborated this idea in this paper, but just to say the line I would try to go if I had to justify it. I think that we all can participate in the practice of argumentation. We are doing it just now. And in the practice of argumentation, we presuppose, at least pretend, to accept the other as free and equal. We don't say, if you would say, I should say that law does not, I should now confess that I'm wrong, that law not raises a claim to correctness, otherwise some persons would wait tonight outside the house and kill me. This would not be an argument. That is, in argumentation, that is the discourse theoretical basis of my theory, that we presuppose in speech that the other is accepted as free and equal. And from this, I think, we can go over to the realm of action, and there we have as a basis human rights, freedom and equality. Well, if this argument, this line of argument, should be sound, it is not a subjective decision of me. I confess that this argument is, in a certain sense, in the line of the old natural law argument. But it is one, because it concerns the rational persons. Persons who are able to make assertions, to put questions, or to put forward arguments are rational persons. And I don't look into the persons, I look in their communicative practice that they do so. Naturally, we can retreat from argumentation. We can stop arguing with others and communicate with weapons. That is possible. But that is only, fortunately, not always happens, and people have all the capacity, at least the capacity of argumentation, and by this I think we have, it is an argument which we can describe of reconstructing what is, or making explicit, as Bernal says, making explicit what is implicit in our practice as human beings.
Thank you. Then the gentleman, the 8th row. Can you raise your hand? Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is continuing in a somewhat similar vein. This is again for Professor Alexy, perhaps half a request for clarification and half a critical question about the degree, I guess, to which this commitment to freedom and equality in the normativity implicit in law is really there, as opposed to simply some sense of rationality. Let me back up. I think I understand you to say that with the claim to correctness, that in its individual fashion, the judge would be engaged in a contradiction to say or believe that he ought not decide X, but yet still do it. And this can be still fairly weak in terms of thinking it's merely an acceptably okay solution. It needn't be uniquely just. It might simply be the idea that this role is a minimally acceptable role to preserve a minimally acceptable system. But, and then at the systemic level, that it would be a contradiction to think that no one ought to be in a role like this and yet continue to perform that role. And I support those claims, I believe, except I think the one area where they do perhaps depend on some rather restrictive assumptions that would lead to, as you put it, interesting cases rather than contradictions, might be ones where the participants don't have the kind of unified conception of ought, of correctness, that seems to be presupposed. The idea that perhaps by following this role, by deciding X, the judge might think themselves to be personally doomed, to be a damned person, but still that it is what ought to be done for, say, the community, whose existence is more important even than personal damnation, a sort of a split in fundamental ought between, say, damnation and a community whose existence is also an incommensurably valuable good. That this unity of ought, and I mean within the perspective of each agent, I'm not sure is entirely shared. I would like to believe that it is implicit in all legal systems that there is this sort of freedom and equality that might rule out things like believing a community's existence is more important than any level of injustice required to preserve it. But I don't think that actually is true. It strikes me that many participants in systems might be willing to sacrifice their own salvation, any amount of moral iniquity in doing their part if they believe that's required to preserve the community. And they might yet do that with that kind of stark sense of self-sacrifice intact. Certainly I can think of novels or movies that really do play on that sense of divided fundamental normativity, a sense of self-damnation in the course of preserving some other good. So I'm wondering if that strikes you as kind of a contradictory, a contradiction, a challenge to this claim of correctness, or such an extreme case that not within sort of a normal legal system, or how exactly you see that fitting within this participant perspective claim to correctness?
Thank you very much. I'm not sure whether I have understood you completely, but my answer, I will try, perhaps it is this direction. I think we must make a distinction between the claim to correctness as such and the content, between the raising of a claim to correctness and the content of the claim to correctness. And what I can show at the first stage of the performative contradiction is only that a claim to correctness is raised, and we say at this stage nothing about its content. It is at this stage conceivable that the claim to correctness says, I apply what has been authoritatively issued. That is, we could imagine a positivistic concept. of the claim to correctness. And I think Kelsen, for instance, would have said this. And then a judge in non-secular state could say, naturally I claim to correctness, but correct is what corresponds to the will of God. He claims correctness. That is, the mere fact that correctness is claims says as such nothing about concerning the content of the claim. That is the first step of my answer. But then, once, and that is the decisive point, once we come to the point that we say that correctness depends on argument, the development begins. That then we have, for instance, the following argument. It is correct, this judgment, because I have made it. That is an argument, but a bad one. And many persons will not believe this argument, at least not for a long time. Or we could say, this is a good decision, this is a correct decision, because it corresponds to the will of God. Not all persons will accept this. And there will be a discussion. That is, therefore, inside the claim to correctness concerning the content can be filled only by a theory of argumentation. Because, I repeat, correctness is justifiability. That is my answer to you. The universal character of correctness, that is the first point. Second, the parochial character of the standards of correctness which actually exist. That is a sociological question, which standards of correctness exist in a certain society at a certain time. But then, if correctness, the claim to correctness is here, and if the claim is connected with argumentation, then we get a dynamic, an ideal dynamic in the system, and the people begin to discuss, and that is that opens up the possibility to get more in rationality than we had before at an earlier historical stage.
Does it work? Yeah.
Yes.
The claim to correctness is like the flying of the birds. It's something that you see everywhere, but maybe it's not a necessary feature of the law. Maybe you can imagine a legal system without the claim to correctness. Now, for the non-positivist, there is the following, from the perspective of the non-positivist, there is the following problem. Either you understand the claim to correctness as something that arises from the law as a whole, or you claim, or you affirm that the claim to correctness arises from the legal authority, not from the law as a whole, but from the legal authority. Now, in the first case, this is not something that the non-positivist can accept easily for the following reason. The non-positivist considers law as formed by sanctioned material, positivist material, and also by moral material, moral principles. Now, these principles are not accepted by the non-positivist because they are sanctioned by some authority. So, in this case, the claim of authority of the law as a whole is a consequence of a non-positivist theory. It cannot figure as an argument for the non-positivist theory. And in the second case, in the case that you take the claim to correctness as arising from the legal authority, for the non-positivist, that is irrelevant, because he sees the morality of the law from a different source, not a positivistic source. So I would complete the point that Professor Shapiro made, that you can accept the claim to correctness and be a good positivist. I would say you can deny the claim to correctness and be a good non-positivist.
Yes, thank you very much. Who raises the claim to correctness? Neil McCormick, the late Neil McCormick, had made the argument that law claims nothing. Law cannot, because only persons who are able to have intentions can raise claims. And now, on the other hand, in a recent publication, Ronald Dworkin has made the argument that Justice Holmes does not raise any claims. He wants to make certain actions he does not like, or society does not like, more expensive. And Dworkin's argument was that the question whether a claim is raised is a psychological, empirical question. And that is my first point. It is not a psychological question, but it has to do with the institutional act of making a legal decision. That we can call the objective or official character of the claim to correctness. And everybody who works for a legal system works as a representative of the legal system. Even if citizens argue about the correctness of a decision of the highest Supreme Court, they argue as representatives of the legal system they had made a wrong decision, as you said, Eugenio. Therefore, my first point is, it is impossible to say that law does not raise a claim to correctness, and I know many positivists, for instance Joseph Ratz, accepts that law raises a claim to correctness. But he argues further, and he even concedes, Ratz says, he calls it claim to legitimate authority. He does not talk about a claim to correctness. Claim to legitimate authority first. And second, that legitimate authority includes moral correctness. But then Joseph Ratz continues that all this is completely compatible with positivism. It does not affect the law. It is like the old Hart thesis that naturally we should require that the law is morally correct. Ratz puts it a little bit over his claim to legitimate moral authority closer to the law, but it has to do, I think, in Ratz with his distinction between the deliberative and the executive stage. According to Ratz, only the executive stage, only what is made on the executive stage belongs to law. And at the executive stage, that are social facts, the parliamentary legislation makes statutes, and then they are present at the executive stage. Or the court makes a decision, then it is present and from on the executive stage. But the arguments, deliberative stage, do not belong to the law. I would like to contest this. Legal arguments belong to the law. And I would like to conceptualize this in the following way. If you have made a decision that Rats agrees with the claim, if the claim to correctness is not fulfilled, then, and that was my example in my paper, that we have an open texture, two possible interpretations, I1 and I2. I1 is just, I2 is unjust. And the judge chooses I2, the unjust decision, in spite of the fact that, according to the wording of the statute, both are possible. Then Joseph Rath says that the decision has a moral defect. And I, according to the claim to correctness, say that is not a legally perfect decision, it is a legally defect decision. And I think that this point, we see on what a small point we now make the distinction between positivism and non-positivism concerning the claim to correctness. We have, in addition, the Radbruch formula, that is the great thing. But in the normal juristic world, we have this, the question whether we accept that there exists two kinds of connection between law and morality. The first is the classificatory connection, that is, that legal norms that fail to meet certain moral standards lose legal validity or even legal character. That is the Radbruch formula. And now we have to ask ourselves, does there exist a second kind of connection between law and justice or morality? And the second kind is the qualifying connection. I sometimes call it also the ideal connection. And this says that a law that fails to meet some justice or moral standards is not only morally defect, but also legally defect. I think that is the decisive point, and has the practical consequence that the higher court, if the decision, the unjust decision is chosen, can at all repeal this decision, and if the Supreme Court declares the unjust decision to be void, whether this is done on moral reason or legal reason. I think that is an important point. Otherwise, we have not. I like to look in the procedural regulations. I have up to now not found, perhaps in one of your countries, there must be in German Rechtsfehler, a legal defect of the decision of the subordinated court. I would like to know whether there are procedural orders in which we find for moral defaults. The highest court can make it up. That would be a possibility, but I think I have not seen up to now this. And if we would have this, it does not matter for even there where it is not written down. The court do so, and they must do so according, I think, to the concept of law.
Thank you. I think we have 7 minutes and 15 seconds and still 5 questions. Then I would like to ask you to be very short. Please, you first, and then Professor Lekapat.
Can you hear? Torben Spak, Uppsala University, Sweden. A quick question for mainly for Professor Alexy. I took, crudely speaking, Professor Bulygin to be saying that positivists could perhaps avoid a considerable, well, to a considerable extent, Alexy's critique by staying within the observer's perspective. And I took Alexy to be saying that, no, you can't do that because legal decision-making involves necessarily the participant's perspective. Now, if I understood that, I'm not even sure that I got that right, but I think that's what I took you to be saying. If so, then I would say that I take legal positivism to be, if anything, a theory of the sources of law, not a theory of legal reasoning or legal decision-making, which means that I'm, on this point, defending Bulygin's claim that positivists could perhaps stay out of the line of fire, so to speak, by remaining within the observer's perspective. What do you think of that?
Positivists like the observer's perspective. You are right. And if I were a positivist, I would do so. But we must raise the question, what is the fundamental perspective, the participants or the observers? And my argument is the participants' perspective is the fundamental one, because without participants, there could not be a legal system. But there could be a legal system without pure observers. And if you define positivism, and much in Eugenio's paper reads the identification problem of which you are talking, reads as positivism as a theory of the sources of law. But then you come, if you look at the discussion about the sources of law, for instance in international law, the legal principles they have, immediately you come to sources in international law and other things, which are social facts, that is the sources thesis of Raths. And then, what are the other reasons? Are they sources of law? And that is what Raths puts on the deliberative states, the legal principles or something like this. Are they sources? Then, if we declare non-social facts, as things that are not social facts as sources of law, then we have transcended, I think, positivism. That is, positivism is not only a theory of the sources of law, but positivism is a theory of a certain type of sources of law.
Hello? Yeah. Okay, it's interesting that the speakers seem to take the participants' point of view as granted when they speak about morality. However, it's equally possible to describe morality as a social phenomenon. So there is also a possibility of observer's position and the participant's position. I think the important difference between law and morality is that in morality, the observer's position is, as Professor Alexy said, strictly redundant. It is possible to be a moral reformer and to say that you have heard to be said, but I say. But in law, I think the observer position and the participant position are interconnected in a different way. You cannot say make a critical legal judgment without presupposing a community in which this legal judgment is supposed to be true. But that's not the case in morality, and that makes moral reform possible. Right.
Yes. Eugenio?
I think it's to you.
Okay, but you should say, okay. I completely agree with you. Law without sources is inconceivable. And even if we would make a thought experiment, that we start at a tabula rasa situation somewhere in history. As soon as the legal system works for a certain time, we have sources, the precedents which were established. And there are even moral reasons why we need sources as social facts. But that is only the one side. As the law is necessary because we cannot solve the problems of social coordination and cooperation by moral argument. If we were able to do so, we would not need law. And therefore, we have law because morality is too weak and deficient. But after we have introduced the law, the old moral questions, that is the question of justice, have not vanished or disappeared completely. They remain alive behind and in the law, and therefore we have, I must be short, the dual character of law.
I still see a contradiction in your position, to which I pointed in my paper, which you denied it without giving any reason for denying it. The contradiction consists in the following. On the one hand, you maintain that law must be defined in such a way that it includes moral elements. But on the other hand, you admit that a social order, which is extremely unjust, where killing and robbing is allowed, still is a legal order. And this, I think, is really a contradiction. Because what kind of moral elements contain such an order, like for instance, Pinochet's regime in Chile or Videla's regime in Argentina, or so on, the list is very long. What moral elements it contains? Your answer is, well, they raise the claim to correctness. But what does it matter that they raise the claim to correctness? If there are killing, robbing, and so on, such strongly immoral actions which are admitted by this social order.
Well, 9 seconds.
If they not raise the claim to correctness, they are no legal order. If they raise it, they are in principle, as this whole system, a legal order. And if there are norms in this legal order which are extremely unjust, Radbruch's formula, then these norms are not legally valid or have no legal character.
I thank you very much.